当たり感だ。
The fall of gaming and how it happened. A phrase not only in the title of the video, but a question I pondered for a very long time now. Back in my early years, gaming was a huge part of my life, and I still say it's a great deal of it now. But nowadays, something just seems missing, with the gaming industry of old just seeming to have completely vanished. And no, I'm not just talking about the evolution of graphics or the clear lack of quality control rampant these days, though that too. I'm talking about what separates the old era from the new. How gaming was once branded as a very childish act by the media and news outlets alike, to a multi-million-dollar industry that influences worldwide stars and social norms of today. How gaming went from a time where nerds would sit at a computer in a small isolated location working on something that would evoke their passions, interests, and curiosity into walking sims equivalent to a mediocre but very high budget Hollywood blockbuster. I mean, how do we go from this to this? It might seem fairly simple at first, but as I thought more about this, I realized it was a tad bit more complicated than what I initially thought. The dichotomy of these two coexisting styles of play and presentation, and how they affected and trivialized the gaming industry as a whole, left me estranged these past few years. And it all comes back down to the core essential prospects that all video games share and were made to have. Hardcore to the bone, inherent challenge. You see, for those who aren't familiar, and honestly I don't see how you're not, but video games, hell, games as a whole since the dawn of time, have always been about the challenge. Whether it be competitive or singular, it was always about reaching for the high score in Pac-Man or charting the leaderboards in Donkey Kong. To the 90s, where skill-based challenge got even more prolific with games like Mega Man X, SMT, or Castlevania. Video games at their quintessential core were about mustering up the psyche to complete an objective in that game that tests you on that game's terms, meaning whether it be the boss fight, the level design, or even other playstyles, such as rhythm games, Guitar Hero, testing you with how many notes you could press in sheer rapid succession. No matter the genre, the core staple of challenge always prevailed. With that said and done, most games and gamers today focus on the spectacle and cinematic prowess of a game, rather than fun and exciting gameplay mechanics. So it's not surprising that a lot of games today, in their practices, greatly discourage the aspect of true challenge. The essence of challenge, as mentioned before, has been one invoked in gaming since the very beginning. So nowadays, when you get a plethora of games, the mainstays, the mainstream, focusing more on spectacle, like a movie, rather than the hardening of skill, this becomes a core problem. And that's not to say there still aren't some challenging games in this day of age. That would just be plain ignorant for me to say, and untrue. But most games aren't as challenging as their contemporaries 10 to 20 years ago, and do tend to discourage such a style of play. For instance, an example I often like to bring up when discussing the inherent shifting in the gaming industry when it comes to sticking to core fundamentals of inherent challenge and turning those ideas on the back of their head is God of War 2018. Now, God of War 2018 was a game that left me in sheer disbelief at just how the now shifting game industry could alter a beloved hack and slash classic into whatever Last of Us ripoff inspired shit this turned into. When the game was first unveiled, I instantly knew what type of game it was going to be. Seeing the trailer and minimalistic gameplay already proved enough of what it was, and rightfully so. What it was a Last of Us clone inspired game through and through. The game borrowing camera angles, gameplay, and narrative cues from The Last of Us. Not to mention the dreaded crafting mechanics that had been done to death even by 2018. Seriously, can games stop doing this? It was played out when the terrible Tomb Raider reboot did it. Now God of War, a game series known for its quick destructive combat, regulated itself to a material hunting game. Not to mention, a lot of games like this just feel like one and done type games with little replay value or variety. A great challenging game often invoked a sense of replayability, but games like God of War 2018 or Horizon, I feel none of that. You see, in the OG God of War games, they were pretty challenging if you played them on anything but easy mode. I know God of War gets a lot of flack for being a button mashy game, which is partially true, but if you just hold square all day on God of War 2, you're gonna die, even on normal mode. There was some degree of skill invoked in these games, from the way you could string together combos with quick and heavy attacks, and maybe integrating them into a quick time Mortal Kombat style fatality. The variety of weapons you had at your disposal, the boss fight variety, cool puzzles, jumping sections, and the camera angle that didn't obstruct your view. Seriously, over the shoulder viewing is not good for a fucking would-be hack and slash. It's great for an FPS or something like The Last of Us, which was a survival-like horror movie game, I guess, but a game like God of War, where the basis of the game is being in the heat of action constantly and having fast reactions at all times, just doesn't work the same in how it did in The Last of Us. But the fact these systems and core gaming-like mechanics never fell out of place in the OG God of Wars and was still successfully able to harbor a narrative that had some degree of depth to it while maintaining these core challenging mechanics was a testament to truly great design. Compare all of this to God of War 2018, which is essentially a husk of its predecessors. Brain dead simplified combat, even on harder difficulty, enemies just tank more damage. Same puzzles rinse and repeated, same damn boss fight, over and over again. You can't even jump. Like, who the hell thought any of this was a good idea? No real weapon variety, lack of real enemy variety compared to the older games, poor RPG elements randomly included, goddamn skill tree, complete with an uninspired boring story that has Kratos, this guy, chaperoning for his equally as annoying son for most of the duration of the game. Wow, what a well thought out and put together game that didn't totally strip all of the challenge and charm from its originators and simplify it for a modern day audience that would be so susceptible to the almost hypnotic like movie aesthetic this game is trying to replicate to the common folk, to ride the coattails and trends started by equally as boring games. No, that couldn't possibly be the case. This game, God of War 2018, is more mature, more creative, and more professional than any of the classic PS2 era God of Wars put together. You just don't understand, said the hypothetical Troglodyte in my backyard. Yeah, stripping all of the charm, freedom, and creativity, and making a watered down pale imitation is where it's at apparently. If that's what qualifies as being better or more mature, be my guest. There's plenty of other examples of this phenomenon rampant in other game franchises too, not just God of War. That was just the perfect example to showcase the difference in game design philosophy and how the marketing to a more streamlined crowd who never even appreciated gaming and what it stood for in its infancy are now all of a sudden the biggest fans, who welcome such bad design changes as a good thing. There's the likes of Resident Evil remakes 2 and 3, whose more western streamlined playstyle ruined what could have been a true remake. Compare it to the OG classics that played and fit the mannerisms a survival horror game should play as that series was the greatest pioneer in the genre since its inception. And these remakes were just bastardizing the classics, an easy mode husk of the originals, tailor-made for a mainstream audience in mind. Like, I could go on in vivid detail with all of the faults of these games, and maybe I will someday, if it isn't too redundant, but it's all besides the main point I'm trying to make and how modern game devs with their games are. Now don't get me wrong, game devs have always chased trends. In fact, industries have always thrived on the notion of competitive trend chasing. A company makes things, another company catches on and follows suit. Sometimes there's grand innovation, sometimes there's grand deviation. Fact of the matter is, trends and looking to replicate such success are here to stay. Like, obviously there were trends in the 90s, 80s, and 2000s. Nobody's denying that, and I'm certainly not. But where the trends of those eras and the trends of now deviate heavily are just how malicious the ones of today are compared to back then. You see, with the rise of the internet and competitive multiplayer gaming being grander than ever, there needs to be incentive to keep playing, to justify a larger player base growing over time. And with the game being free or costing the 60, it's bound to have no shortage of bullshit microtransactions to empty the pockets of people who tend to complain about this phenomenon, yet still pay anyways. Not me though. I never pay for microtransactions, always seen it as a scummy and shady thing from a business point of view, especially when it's something as simple as weapon skins. Just why? Just a cheaper way to rake in more money than ever, using the guise of false additional content that should be free, and it's pathetic. There was once a time in gaming where you could get cool add-ons on the game by merely updating it, and not having to pay a cent extra after purchasing the game. I have no major gripes with the concept of DLC per se. My problem lies in how they're often implemented. Even DLC like microtransactions, as mentioned before, are just as shady, if not more than the normal season pass stuff. It's especially worse when there have been numerous instances where devs will sell something as DLC that was already in the game's code. It would be different if it was a new asset made after the game's release, maybe a few months down the pipeline. But when the content is already made and you still charge money, it's the most pathetic shit I've ever seen, Capcom. I mean, sometimes these microtransactions can literally break the foundation of a game. A lot of game genres, especially those heavily leaning into the competitive scene, such as FPSs, real-time strategy, and fighting games, become damn near broken and unplayable. Plenty of online competitive games actually suffer from devs not taking into account certain features being implemented by way of DLC or microtransactions. Whether it be poor balancing issues, not listening to fans, or just falling for a business model that, although scummy, seems to work from a financial standpoint at the cost of its player base's trust. But call me crazy, that just seems like a flawed design by definition. I mean, seriously, there are some characters added in games like Smash Bros that are so broken they're literally banned from tournaments, or characters in Street Fighter and Tekken that need to be nerfed to be fair. But in the meantime, just have fun playing against a broken character that somebody paid for until the devs decide to actually fix the problem after several hundred patches later. And that's basically what I'm getting at with this point. The lack of challenge in what was supposed to be a competitive game becomes minuscule in difficulty when you can just pay for broken characters or broken features, giving those who pay heavy leverage over those who don't. Remember the Star Wars Battlefront 2 remake fiasco from EA? No? Yeah, wouldn't blame you since the game died in a heartbeat. But it had got so bad with the game, EA had to disable microtransactions for a time being, due to the fact purchasing the abilities that gave you a great advantage in online play was destroying the competitive scene, and many were pissed. The only way to unlock the star card features was to heavily grind, but most people just bought them, making those who couldn't afford or didn't want to succumb to the greed basically useless in online play, due to the unfair nature of it all, destroying the multiplayer of the game in the process. Yeah, eventually they altered it in some way to make it easier to obtain the abilities after a damn year or so. Yeah, great way to kill your game. But the fact this even happened in the first place shows a great problem with games of today, and how they just sacrifice the inherent applicability of challenge for bullshit trivial nonsense like this that should have never happened in the first place. Now let's rewind a little, just for a brief moment, for a little juxtaposition. See, back in the day, gaming was relatively harmless from a corporate standpoint. Yeah, there was the occasional bullshit peripheral like Sega's antics, or some useless add-on like the N64 DD, but it's not like you were forced to buy them to play fairly, or to play a game at all, for the most part. Nor did it give you a disadvantage or an advantage in gameplay. They were just fun add-ons that sometimes made gaming funner or had little effect in the competitive sense. Or the trends of old where corporations were really trying to see what customers really liked. Remember all of the cartoon platformers that clearly took inspiration from Sonic the Hedgehog, which in turn took from Mario? Or all the shooters trying to replicate Doom and sometimes surpassing with their own unique flair, like Duke Nukem or Wolfenstein, Perfect Dark. The resurgence of iconic JRPGs due to the great success of Final Fantasy, games that often excelled and expanded on the design philosophy of those classic games. All of the Resident Evil inspired games that took cues from the classic horror franchise and alternated in a way to make it their own unique style, like Fear Effect, Omnimusha. You see, the trends back then were based off a desire to appeal to a consumer base, not to alienate or insult them. Whether the intent delivered a worthwhile playing experience is merely subjective. What isn't subjective is the fact it was all based off effort, passion, and a unique gaming pathos that's not prevalent in modern day gaming. Very different from how now corporations are basically trying to turn individual games into live services. Dumbest shit I've ever seen. This kind of playing model works fine for MMOs or Battle Royales, and even then that's pushing it, but sure, because those games need constant activity with a consistent player base to maintain relevancy and generate revenue on a sustainable scale. But when there are single player games with multiplayer functions, like COD or some real-time strategy, it starts to get very obnoxious, almost predatory in nature, locking behind content that gives players leeway over others, or content that shouldn't be locked in the first place, or at least be easier to obtain, like weapon fucking skins, among the other reasons mentioned prior. I mean, nowadays they sell you an incomplete bug-ridden game at full retail price, and it's supposed to get better after months of updates, which is something almost all devs do now, adding on to the fact just how dishonest modern devs are with their games. Now this is the part of the video I wanted to get to the most, so sit back and relax if you've made it this far and haven't cried off somewhere. I know the truth sometimes hurts. Okay, so I mentioned extensively how the core nature of gaming always lied in the inherent challenge of it all. Whether it be singular or multi-competitive, what binded all games was the difficulty of the challenge. Okay, gotcha. But what has forsaken this level of non-adherence to gaming's original philosophy? I gave two great examples showcasing part of the reason why the shift has become so drastic over time to appeal to a modern-day streamlined audience, foregoing what made games challenging: skill, creativity, replayability, the freedom to approach certain obstacles in certain mannerisms, and not just a handholdy, easier kind of way. But what if I told you, on top of all of that, there's a sadder truth to it all? A harsh truth that is so undeniable on all accounts? The creation philosophy of how games are designed has simply regressed. Yeah, right now you might be typing on your keyboard saying, well, the game design has changed. You think they're just gonna keep making the same shit over and over again? Then again, that's not what I'm implying. What I'm implying is the core of what game devs had to work with often made the game excel or fail. Experimentation leads to innovation. You see, games were often restricted on what they could do due to hardware limitations, and those limitations in turn sparked the creative drive. How can we fit a game this size, not made for this console, on a 64-bit system? They found the way. How do we load a great deal of a stage in a way that prevents game-breaking bugs and renders everything in a fashionable way? Thus, loading video game screens were invented. How do we fit this much story, gameplay, and data on the system that can only handle so many megabytes? Multiple disk-based games were invented. There's many instances of devs using what little they had to invent ways to make their games run on although restricted and limited, very optimizable hardware. I mean, just look at what they were able to do with the draw distance in the original Spyro the Dragon. This level of distance and sheer depth perception hadn't been achieved before on console hardware, and this was 3 years after the PlayStation's initial launch. The crazy optimization of the Genesis and how its faster draw speed led to games that could be played at a faster speed than its competitors. First ever fully voice acted singing intro in the game, Tales of Fantasia, on the SNES in '95. Sin and Punishment's unique take on the rail shooter genre on the N64. A system known for being fairly weak in power, but this game had load screens that transitioned in a mannerism you couldn't even tell things were loading. Even predates Jak and Daxter, which was the first game to have entirely zero load screens, on the PS2 at that. Not even modern gaming could compete with a feat like that. A lot of this stuff seems minimalist nowadays, but these sort of grand innovations is why the design of games are now dull and generic by comparison. Want to make a hit game with minimum effort? Just slap together a done-to-death idea and add a barren open world with zero to doing it, and voila, that's modern gaming in a nutshell. I mean, you know it's bad, where most game devs to this day still pride themselves on vast open world, as if extra space to navigate a linear story does anything for the game. That point right there is the main reason these open world games often have fast travel, cause there's literally little or nothing to do in the worlds of most of these games, besides boring mundane side quests that you typically find in your average MMO, which is the main reason MMOs have open worlds, but that doesn't work the same or feel as fun in a single player style game. Not to mention, some of these single player open world games are starting to need constant internet access to even be playable. Sheer insanity. But that brings up a whole different realm of discussion. I don't know exactly where this trend of making a game open world somehow makes it better came from, but that was never the case. It probably comes back to the appeal of it. People like the idea of an open world game, but the execution in the titles we have thus far have been mediocre to just pointless. Few games get this technical feat right, like Breath of the Wild, but that's few too many for so many open world games coming out over the last decade. It's as if these devs are like, everyone likes open world games, gets excited for them, hyped for them. Let's make our own and squeeze some revenue out of these losers, minus the charm and consistency of those better examples. That's why there are so many Breath of the Wild ripoffs. Then there's making games that work better in a more traditional linear level-based structure like Assassin's Creed fall flat when turned into an open world game. On top of the inherent oversaturation of the poorly tacked on RPG elements in games never meant to have them. I mean, RPG elements in Assassin's fucking Creed? Seriously? A game meant to be a spiritual successor to the Prince of Persia games. Seems like every game in that mother that clearly isn't a damn RPG has to have RPG inspired mechanics like leveling up, skill trees, etc. Just more a product of how creative game design is often undermined for cheap and fast, shoehorned in trendy mechanics that didn't need to be there in the first place. I'd rather a linear style game with mechanics that adhere to the genre it's in than a barren open world, boring mess of a game with the same fucking stolen crafting and skill trees 24/7, specifically in games that were never even meant to have them. Yes, game design and how devs approach creating games have definitely taken a nosedive over the years, which is such an odd thing to say given the fact technology is grander than ever. You would think with how advanced tech is compared to 20 years ago, it would spark more creative ventures, not stagnate. But it does stagnate. Stagnates very hard. So then, given the inherent flaws laid out to you on the forefront of modern gaming, how do we come to a compromise? Another question I've often facilitated but never had a core answer. Some might suggest that most of my criticism is specifically geared towards AAA gaming. So the right alternative would be to go for indie games, right? Wrong. Indie games often have their own fair share of problems, which lends me personally to not liking that market as a whole. Most indie games are half-baked attempts to replicate already existing AAA and failing. From the thousands of Symphony of the Night and Metroidvania ripoffs to the plethora of Mega Man clones, this type of oversaturated market doesn't really help anyone, on top of the unpolished nature of a lot of these games. Although most of these games maintain the core of challenge and difficulty within them, which is a good thing, the problems I mentioned before can't be excused. And I get it. These are indie games made by a very small group of people who take great inspiration from those AAA games. That's still no excuse for the lack of polish these games often have, and how a lot of the more popular ones are just ripping or taking ideas from coexisting games, but not as good. Nothing about these type of games really move the industry forward or offer a better experience you can't already find from an official publisher, and I'm not talking about the graphics. There are a few unique games like Cave Story, but most are laughably mediocre or just plain terrible from what I've been able to gauge. The truth is, there is no real compromise to the issues facing modern gaming, at least to change it on the grand scale. The only real alternative to the harsh reality of modern garbage gaming is indie games. Maybe one day that market will evolve for the better and not deteriorate like current mainstream gaming. Best advice I can give is to support remasters of classic games. Support the HD collections of classic games from companies like Square Enix, Capcom, Namco, Konami. Companies like that know there's still an audience who appreciate the yesteryear era of gaming for how good it truly was. But if those remasters don't sell well, flop, it's back to more walking sims and interactive movie games, live service bullshit. At least that's how I've mainly been supporting the gaming industry, by paying for well done remasters and not scummy microtransactions. Then again, even remasters aren't safe. Like with the Mass Effect remaster fiasco, and of course Rockstar in that shitty GTA D-make.
I'm making you play the game. Once you start to play it for a while, you keep on playing.
Any normal person would want to beat the machine.
And you come back
Oh, sure.
again,
Oh, sure.
again.
Yeah.
Seen all morning. Shit.
Now for some closing thoughts. The future of gaming is only looking as bright as the people who play them. Settling for less will lead to severe stagnation, but doing nothing at all won't change anything. Gaming at its core is about challenge and having fun, and there's nothing fun about the greedy nature of modern game devs, and until that changes, my feelings on modern gaming will never change. Setting the quality precedents of old is feasible, yet all the more harder for it. With that being said, thank you for your watch and goodbye.